What do you get when a gospel diva with a sharp tongue and a preacher with fire in his voice collide on the internet? Chaos, and not the holy kind. Kim Burrell and Gino Jennings weren't trending because of some powerful message from the pulpit or a gospel hit climbing the charts. No, they were trending for all the wrong reasons. The kind that made even the most faithful churchgoers take a step back and ask, what is really going on here? You won't believe the layers of backlash that unfolded, and let me tell you, this is just the beginning. Kim Burrell had always been a force in gospel music. People called her the queen of jazzy gospel, her voice one of a kind. But somewhere along the way, her gifts started getting overshadowed by controversy. It all started in 2016 when a sermon from her Houston church hit the internet like a wildfire. In it, she spoke against homosexuality in a tone that wasn't just bold, it was aggressive. The video went viral, and within hours, media outlets, activists, and even fellow artists were coming for her. Scheduled performances got canceled. Ellen DeGeneres herself removed Kim from her show, where Kim was supposed to sing alongside Burrell. That one sermon didn't just cause a storm. It became the spark that lit the fuse. But here's the shocking part. Kim didn't take a step back. In fact, she doubled down. She didn't just stand by her words. She continued making statements that had people asking, is this gospel or is this just arrogance? Over the next few years, she made headlines again and again. One of the biggest was in 2022. During a church service, Kim stood at the pulpit and told the crowd, some of y'all are broke, living from credit card to credit card, and still talking about you got favor. The crowd laughed nervously. But when that clip hit social media, the internet didn't laugh, it exploded. People dragged her online, calling her classist, tone deaf, and out of touch with the very people who had built her career, church folks. And when Kim finally spoke out, instead of calming the storm, she poured gas on it. Her apology felt more like a rant. Y'all want me to be fake? I'm not fake. I speak the truth. If you don't like it, unfollow me. And that's exactly what thousands of people did. Concerts were pulled. Gospel stations stopped playing her music. But this is where it gets interesting. While all this was happening publicly, something darker was happening behind closed doors. Former musicians and church members who had worked with Kim started to speak out, some anonymously, some with names. One background singer shared, she was a genius vocally, but backstage it felt like we were walking on eggshells. Others talked about verbal outbursts, prideful behavior, and how everything had to revolve around Kim. Still, despite the mounting accusations, some fans defended her fiercely, saying, she's just keeping it real. But what makes this story different is that more and more insiders were no longer afraid to speak up. At the same time, while Kim Burrell was being roasted for her words, another figure was building a storm of his own. Gino Jennings, a pastor from Philadelphia who didn't just preach boldly, he preached like every word was fire. But his sermons didn't just call out sin, they tore people down. And the internet loved it. His YouTube channel was growing fast. Titles like Pastor Destroys Modern Christianity or Jennings Exposes Fake Christians went viral every week. But behind those viral titles was something more serious. Many said Gino wasn't just preaching, he was spiritually bullying people. He called women wearing pants and makeup Jezebels. He said no real woman of God would dress like that. You might think that would slow him down, but it didn't. He doubled down, just like Kim. Any criticism he faced, he called it the devil's work. He said people were just uncomfortable with the truth. But here's the craziest part. People inside his church started saying things that sounded more like a cult than a congregation. One woman went viral saying, I was told if I ever left the church, I would go to hell. She said they told her all other churches were fake and Gino's church was the only true one. Others said women couldn't dress how they wanted, work where they wanted, or even get an education without the church's permission. They were isolated from their families, controlled in their choices, and publicly shamed if they stepped out of line. A leaked audio clip even came out earlier this year. In it, a voice that sounded exactly like Gino said, "If you start letting women lead, you might as well hand the devil the mic. This church is for real men." Though he never confirmed if that voice was his, many believed it, and it only added to the growing demand to hold him accountable. Still, despite the noise, his platform kept growing. His sermons pulled millions of views, because let's face it, controversy sells, and Gino Jennings knew exactly how to use it. So while the public kept arguing over whether Kim Burrell and Gino Jennings were just bold or downright toxic, a new wave was quietly building online. One that no one, not even these powerful figures, could stop. This is where it gets interesting. Social media had always been a tool for fame, but now it became a weapon for truth. Hashtags like #ChurchHurt and #Zarkerchart started trending, and with them came thousands of videos, TikToks, and posts, people telling their own painful stories about how the church, and specifically leaders like Kim and Gino, had hurt them. One of the most viral stories came from a woman named Nicole. She was a former praise and worship leader who had once worked under a ministry directly connected to Kim Burrell. Her voice trembled as she sat in her car, recording a TikTok that would be seen by nearly 500,000 people. "I was never enough," she said. "Andre, not pretty enough, not rich enough, not anointed enough to stand beside her." Nicole said she saw people get dismissed, ignored, and even humiliated for the smallest things, not because they lacked talent, but because they didn't fit Kim's image of what anointed looked like. Let me tell you, this video opened the floodgates. Comment after comment poured in. Hundreds of people, some anonymous, some using their real names, all telling similar stories. Not just about Kim, but about church culture as a whole. About how the same people preaching love and grace were the ones shaming, isolating, and controlling others behind the scenes. It wasn't just a one-off problem. It was a pattern. And the craziest part, many of them stayed silent for years out of fear. Fear of being called rebellious, fear of being cut off from their community, fear of being cursed spiritually or socially. Then came a YouTube channel called Preachers Unfiltered, and that's when things really blew up. The channel began dedicating full episodes to analyzing sermons from popular preachers, including Kim Burrell and Gino Jennings. But this wasn't just gossip. These videos broke down sermons line by line, comparing them to known control tactics used by cults and authoritarian groups. One 90-minute episode shocked everyone. It showed clips of Gino Jennings' sermons side by side with footage from actual cult leaders, and the similarities were disturbing. This wasn't just someone being a strict preacher. This was someone using fear, shame, and spiritual manipulation to control people's lives. "This isn't about doctrine," the YouTube host explained. "This is about control. When you punish people for questioning you, shame them for leaving, and weaponize scripture to limit their worth, you're not preaching. You're manipulating." And suddenly it clicked for many viewers. They started realizing that what they once thought was anointed boldness was actually emotional abuse disguised as holiness. But here's the shocking part. This wasn't limited to social media anymore. Entire Reddit threads and Facebook support groups formed, all filled with survivors of toxic church culture. Many of them mentioned Kim Burrell and Gino Jennings directly. They shared stories of emotional breakdowns, public humiliation, financial manipulation, where members were guilted into giving money they didn't have just to prove their faith. One woman said her husband was pressured to take out a loan just to meet a church-giving goal, and when they refused, they were called lukewarm believers in front of the entire congregation. Destiny took an unexpected turn when mainstream media started catching on. Articles began to pop up, not celebrating these preachers' ministries, but exposing the controversies surrounding them. Podcasts and YouTube channels began inviting former members to speak openly. And for the first time, people were listening, not just to the preachers, but to the ones who had been hurt by them. Even inside the gospel community, the atmosphere changed. Younger generations, especially millennials and Gen Z, started walking away, not just from Kim and Gino, but from the church altogether. They were tired of seeing pastors live like celebrities while members struggled. Tired of watching gospel artists get praised for their gift, but never held accountable for their pride. Tired of the silence around abuse just because someone could sing or preach. People started asking the hard questions. Why are leaders protected while members suffer? Why is bold preaching used as a smokescreen for bullying? Why does gospel fame excuse so much spiritual harm? These were the questions Kim Burrell and Gino Jennings never seemed to answer. They kept preaching, kept posting, kept ignoring the growing noise, but the court of public opinion was getting louder than ever. As more and more voices came forward, it became clear this wasn't just a scandal, it was a movement. The church, once seen as a sacred refuge, was now under a microscope. And this is where it gets even more disturbing. People who had never spoken before, musicians, ushers, ex-leaders, even assistant pastors, began sharing their stories. Stories not just of harsh sermons, but of psychological control, fear-based theology, and broken spirits. Some said they were told that questioning the leader was equal to questioning God, that leaving the church meant opening yourself up to demonic attacks. Others said their families were ripped apart, cut off because they refused to follow every rule or dared to leave. One young man named Darius spoke in a podcast saying, "I was taught that Gino Jennings was the only one preaching the true gospel, that everyone else was a deceiver. We weren't just discouraged from going to other churches. We were told that they were run by Satan himself." He said he didn't just lose his church when he left. He lost his friends, his girlfriend, even his relationship with his parents who still attended. It took me years to realize that wasn't God. That was control. And the craziest part, while these stories flooded the internet, the church leaders at the center stayed mostly silent. No apologies, no accountability, just more sermons, more defense, and more division. Kim Burrell, despite being dropped by stations and canceled by events, continued showing up to churches that still welcomed her. She even made jokes about the backlash during a sermon, saying, "Y'all mad because I told the truth. That's all right. I'll be singing in heaven while y'all still offended on earth." Meanwhile, Gino Jennings continued gaining followers. His YouTube channel passed 400,000 subscribers. His sermons still drew packed crowds. His words still echoed across pulpits and phones everywhere. Because controversy, it didn't kill their platforms. It fed them. People who felt disillusioned with soft Christianity saw Jennings as a hero. They didn't mind the harsh tone. In fact, they craved it. They were tired of smiling pastors who said everything was okay. Jennings gave them what they thought was real truth, even if it came wrapped in intimidation and fear. But what makes this story different is what happened next. For years, people felt powerless against spiritual leaders. Pastors like Kim and Gino moved freely, protected by their positions and surrounded by loyal followers who saw any criticism as a personal attack on God. But not anymore. A shift has started, a bold, relentless demand for accountability, and it was growing stronger every day. Podcasts, documentaries, and exposés began shining a light on what had long been hidden in shadows. Entire episodes broke down how scriptures were being twisted, not to uplift, but to dominate. A former Bible study teacher even released a full blog explaining how verses used by Jennings were taken out of context to support misogynistic views. And people listened. They started to ask, what if we've been manipulated all along? What if boldness isn't the same as truth? What if we've confused arrogance for anointing? And that's when something remarkable started to happen. New leaders began rising, not the flashy, stage-loving kind, but the real ones. Young pastors and gospel artists who weren't afraid to speak out, who openly called out spiritual abuse, who invited questions instead of shutting them down. They created new worship spaces online and in person where people could come as they were without fear of shame or spiritual manipulation. Let me tell you, this wasn't just a trend, it was a revolution. People who once idolized Kim Burrell or followed Gino Jennings blindly were starting to say, I loved your gift, but I can't follow your character. They were no longer afraid to walk away, no longer afraid to call out hypocrisy, no longer afraid to choose healing over habit. So now, with all the scandals exposed, the stories shared, and the masks finally slipping, the question remained, what now? Could the church truly recover from this wave of exposure? Or had something been permanently broken? For many, the damage ran deep. The church, once seen as a place of healing, now looked like a stage where ego and charisma were praised more than humility or truth. And people had had enough. Some walked away completely, not just from Kim or Gino, but from the idea of church altogether. Not because they stopped believing in God, but because they stopped trusting the ones who claimed to speak for him. Let me tell you, this shift wasn't just emotional, it was generational. Millennials and Gen Z were no longer falling for titles, robes, or long sermons filled with fire. They were asking for proof, for accountability, for realness. They weren't impressed by shouting preachers or powerful voices anymore. They wanted character over charisma. They wanted answers, not arrogance. And this is where it gets interesting. Instead of letting the scandals push them away from faith, many started creating a new path. They built podcasts, small fellowships, YouTube ministries, and online spaces focused on healing, focused on truth, focused on Jesus, not celebrity preachers. One quote that went viral in the middle of this whole storm came from Marcus, a former church musician who had once played for big names in gospel. He said in a podcast, "The gospel of Jesus Christ is still pure, but we've made gods out of performers and kings out of pastors. That's not faith, that's idolatry." That statement hit hard. It was shared thousands of times because it put into words what many had been feeling but couldn't say. The truth wasn't broken, but the culture around it was. And here's the hopeful part. Change had already started. People were finally learning to separate the message from the messenger. Just because someone could sing or preach didn't mean they were above correction. Just because they had a gift didn't mean they had the right spirit. And that's where real accountability begins. It wasn't about canceling people. It was about telling the truth, even when it hurt. Even when it exposed people we once admired, even when it forced us to look in the mirror and say, we allowed this. But healing couldn't stop at hashtags or temporary outrage. It had to go deeper. Churches had to stop protecting leaders just because they were popular. They had to stop silencing victims and start listening to them, start believing them, start honoring their pain instead of gaslighting it. People were tired of watching leaders preach one thing and live another, tired of sermons about humility from pastors who lived in mansions, tired of being told to submit while their pain was ignored. The pulpit was never meant to be a pedestal. It was meant to be a place of service, a place where leaders lifted others up, not tore them down. And if leaders like Kim Burrell and Gino Jennings wanted to be remembered for more than controversy, they had a choice to make. Would they humble themselves? Would they take accountability? Would they stop blaming the world and start looking inward? That's the turning point. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about scandal. It's about a spiritual shift. A generation that's waking up, that's asking hard questions, and that's no longer worshiping personalities. They're pursuing truth. They're choosing healing. And they're doing church differently. So what do you think? Were Kim Burrell and Gino Jennings simply bold voices, or did they go too far? Can the gospel world truly heal, or has the damage already been done? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if this video opened your eyes, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this with someone who's asking what's really happening behind the pulpit. Because this isn't just about church drama, it's about a spiritual awakening. And maybe, just maybe, destiny took an unexpected turn for the better